Okay, great. So we'll go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Rebecca Miller. I am the director of the DC Preservation League. Thank you all for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to the third of 6 Stewardship for Climate Action programs. We're really excited about this one in particular because it will be highlighting different buildings around in the district, Maryland and Virginia areas that have utilized sustainability activities in order to improve their functionality. So thank you for joining us. So for those of you who are looking to receive AIA continuing education credits, an email will be sent following this program asking you to fill out a form with your AIA number. So please look for that. And if you have any issues, please email us at info@dcpreservation.org. Next slide. I'd like to start off by thanking our annual program sponsors. And it is with their support that we're able to put on free and low-cost programming, such as the programs in this series. Next slide, please. And then I'd also like to thank our planning committee. These individuals that are led by Carl Elefante. They have provided their time, experience, and contacts that has been invaluable to a small organization like DCPL in order to pull these programs off. Next slide. And then for those of you who are not familiar with the DC Preservation League, we were founded in 1971 as Don't Tear It Down on the 2nd annual Earth Day, with our first street action being protesting the proposed demolition of the old post office building on Pennsylvania Avenue. After securing the retention of the old post office building and other buildings like the Willard Hotel and the Franklin School, Don't Tear It Down focused its efforts on other downtown buildings, and by writing what is now the District of Columbia Historic Landmark and Historic District Protection Act of 1978. Next slide. In 1984, DCPL Don't Tear It Down changed its name to the DC Preservation League to focus on a greater citywide focus. This was so that we could help neighborhood groups more efficiently, also focus on downtown, but spread our advocacy work more citywide. Next slide. The environmental and preservation movements in Washington were in their infancy when the organization was founded, and both have grown tremendously over the last 50 years. And DCPL is thrilled to be celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and as part of the celebration, DCPL focused its advocacy and education efforts on 3 major themes that have included preservation's role in city planning, diverse stories, which is honoring the cultural diversity of our city through historic preservation, and sustainability, which is combating the climate crisis through historic preservation. Next slide. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Carl Elefante, who is our program chair for this series. And Carl is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and also of the Association of Preservation Technology. He is principal emeritus with Quinn Architects, where he served as design principal on architecture, historic preservation, and community revitalization projects. And he's known for coining the phrase, "the greenest building is the one that is already built." Carl writes and lectures internationally on historic preservation, sustainable design, climate change, and urban topics. He's a senior fellow with Architecture 2030, working to advance building sector decarbonization globally, and is a founding member of the Climate Heritage Network, promoting the value of cultural and heritage in curtailing climate change. He's also an adjunct professor at the Catholic University of America and the University of Maryland. So he's quite busy. So we're thrilled to have him participating in these programs with us. So with that, I will turn it over to Carl. Please enjoy the program.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and welcome everyone. Good to have you here, and exciting to be jumping into program 3 here. So it's been more than a year since Rebecca got in touch with me and we first started talking about how could DCPL really update their activities in intersecting preservation and sustainability. And of course, that conversation led to talking about climate change, because we're really in the climate change era now. And so this 6-program series really developed as an effort to align heritage and existing building stewardship and the DC Climate Action Plan, its larger climate action leadership ambitions, and its community development and community equity priorities. I use the word "and" instead of "with" because it's not just getting our stewardship aligned with those programs, but it's also helping to inform those programs, which frankly today, are not as responsive to the concerns of culture and heritage stewardship and even existing building stock stewardship. So it is a two-way street that we're trying to engage with. Next, please. So program 1 laid the foundation for understanding DC as a community, both quantitatively and qualitatively. We were very fortunate to have Dr. Mindy Thompson-Fullilove from the New School in New York City, and also Gregory Swires from George Washington University here in the city join us and bring the socio-psychologist and sociologist overview of the city and really understand the conditions that exist today in the city as social and economic conditions, and what how the built environment really contributes to urban hardships and inequities and how it must contribute to their solutions. We were also joined that day by Brian Kraft, who is DC's foremost mapping expert, and Sarah Vonish, a historian who works with EHT Traceries, who presented the history of DC's urban evolution over more than 2 centuries. So we really left with a good understanding of DC as a community, both bricks and mortars and people. Next slide, please. In program 2, we heard about DC's community development strategies and climate action ambitions directly from those who have shaped it and who are accountable for actually achieving its goals. We had as representatives of the Office of Planning, Rogelio Flores, Stephen Geyer, and Amania Price, and then from the DC Department of Energy and Environment, Casey Studhalter and Katie Bergfeld. So we really got a good understanding of both the DC Climate Action Plan and Comprehensive Plan and so on. Next slide, please. So for program 3, we're going to see how this really is translating into the work of architects and engineers and contractors around the city by looking at 8 building retrofit case studies. All of these projects have been pursuing the twin goals of reusing and sometimes significantly adapting existing buildings, but also at the same time achieving high performance, energy efficiency, and more recently, projects have really established decarbonization or carbon emission reduction goals as well. The first 4 residential projects, and they range from a single family house to a couple of quite large scale apartment buildings. After a short break, then we'll hear about 4 commercial/institutional projects, again, across a broad range of scales and occupancy types. While they vary greatly in project specifics, all of these projects work to push the limits of integrating building reuse and sustainable design, and that's really why we wanted to present them to you today. Some are designated historic buildings, but not all, and some are structures that are located in historic districts as well. But each presentation will be very brief, an introduction to the projects that deserve far more attention than we have time to give them today. But our goal is to illustrate the breadth and the depth of building reuse strategies that are happening all around us in our community here in DC. So let's begin. Next slide, please. First, we're going to present La Quercia, which is a property that is owned by Harvard University, part of their Dumbarton Oaks Center for Landscape. And with us today from Cunningham Quill Architects are Ralph Cunningham, FAIA, and David Coxson, AIA. The project is located in Georgetown's historic district. You will see it's the work that they did to create a sustainable project with a high performance envelope and energy efficient systems. We'll hear about its LEED rating and Harvard Green Building Standards, et cetera. So with that, let me turn it over to Ralph and David. Thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you very much. I'm Ralph Cunningham from Cunningham Quill Architects, and we are delighted to be here this morning with this distinguished group. And I see a number of people in the audience that we know, and including a few that have worked for Dunbar and Oaks with us. So we deeply appreciate all of your help with this project. We've been working for Dunbar and Oaks for a number of years now. And David Coxson, who is with me, has worked on all of those projects, and the relationship continues to the present. And they are, Dunbar and Oaks and Harvard is absolutely a wonderful client. So we're very excited to show you this project today, and I will turn it over to David.
Hi, thank you, Ralph. I am David Coxson. As Ralph mentioned, I have worked on all of the DO projects. I think we're up to 5 now. We have a new one that just started, and the Quercia was our 4th. But we got our first project with Dunbar and Oaks as a result of the Quercia. So the Quercia, these are some of the projects, the images that you see in front of you are 4 of the projects that we worked on with Dunbar and Oaks. Starting in the upper left-hand corner, the Fellowship House, which was an adaptive reuse and renovation of an existing building on Wisconsin Avenue, 1700 Wisconsin Avenue in R Street. The renovation of the reading room library on the main campus, as well as the Quercia, which is on 30th Street, about an 8-minute walk from the main campus of Dunbar and Oaks, and within the historic district of Georgetown. And a couple of other smaller ones, which we don't have up on the screen. We got the first project, Dunbar and Oaks Fellowship House, as a result of the Quercia, as I said. The Quercia was purchased by Dunbar and Oaks in 1994 as a student housing building for their fellows program, in addition to the beautiful main gardens designed by Beatrix Ferrand, and the main house designed by McKim, Mead and White, and renovated over time, and which now serves as a museum space for pre-Columbian art and Byzantine art. The institution itself serves as a place for scholarly research for fellows accepted into the Harvard program to study pre-Columbian art, Byzantine art, and landscape studies. So in 1994, I'll go to the next slide. 1994, the Quercia was purchased with the goal of housing an additional 20 fellows. The main fellows housing building was in the Beatrix Ferrand guest house right here. La Quercia is down here in orange on 30th Street. The building was designed in 1921 as an apartment building, and which underwent some series of facilities upgrades and some maintenance, but really had, by the point we got to it, had a ton of deferred maintenance issues that we'll go over, and which Dunbar and Oaks had really outgrown and had considered selling off when they purchased the 1700 Wisconsin Avenue building here, which we adaptively reused. It was a 1940s commercial building, started as a typewriter factory and sales building, and which went through a whole host of different tenants up until we got our hands on it, which was the Cameroonian embassy. So interesting building history, in which we converted into 25 units for fellows and their families, as well as place for fellowship and presentation spaces as well. Now this is the after shot of La Quercia. We started in 2016 with this project, working on a feasibility study. Dumbarton Oaks, under the leadership of Jan Zilkowski, who was the director at the time. The fellowship program was growing, and they quickly outgrew the fellowship house and needed additional space. So they decided to keep this, but wanted to look into what it meant to upgrade this and to get it to a point where it would be comfortable, it would be durable and healthy. It was through our feasibility study, we quickly realized that there was no natural ventilation. There were moisture issues, mold issues, structural issues, envelope issues. It was just a really poorly performing building and a really unhealthy building in which the tenants at the time did not want to stay there and complained about living there. So our task was large ahead of us. The feasibility study quickly identified the energy efficiency issues and the envelope issues, like I said, as well as some of the more site-related issues. Currently, you see, and this is the existing site plan, previously existing site plan on 30th Street, which has 2 side yards which were underutilized, and the north lot was used as a kind of a mechanical well for their large outdoor chiller, which was extremely loud, had about a 10-foot fence around it. There's an indoor boiler, 2-pipe system, which was outdated and did not perform very well, in addition to a building that lacked accessibility. So all these things we addressed in our feasibility study, and got the budget with Harvard and set out to re-envision and update this building. During that feasibility study, the goals that we identified were a new energy efficient HVAC system, which we ended up going with a VRF system, heat recovery system. We introduced fresh outdoor air and ventilation through a rooftop DOAS and ERV system. Identified building envelope improvements, including a fully insulated membrane roof, new roof, all new replacement windows, energy efficient double glazed windows, as well as interior furred walls. There was no mass masonry wall. There was no insulation in the envelope. In addition to that, we ended up studying a PV solar array layout for at least a 12 kW electrical generation, which we achieved. And so those were some of the energy goals. Some of the program goals included all new and fully furnished, fully renovated living units for fellows, new common amenity spaces for fellowship and interaction, all new interior finishes, as well as implementing really a new design aesthetic, which had not been previously existing on the Dumbarton Oaks campus, in which we looked at the fellowship house as a continuation of that design aesthetic with some updates to this building. All new LED lighting. We had circadian lighting, which we can talk more about in the living units themselves. All new site improvements, usable outdoor space, security and IT improvements, and ultimately the baseline goal was to achieve LEED Commercial Interiors version 3 gold certification. And we worked with Harvard Green Building Services and their green building standards for this project, as well as Fellowship House, and we can talk more about that. But they were the sustainability arm at Harvard that were really great to work with, and which have pretty stringent baseline requirements for projects of different capital projects of different tiers. This is a tier 2A project, meaning it's mostly an interior retrofit project of a certain budget. Existing site plan, you see the rooftop solar, our DOAS ERV, our mechanical VRF outdoor units, as well as some of the site strategies here with our new south and north courtyards, all new plantings and site walls along the front of the building here. This is 30th Street running on the side. It is also served by an alley, upgraded parking, trash enclosures, as well as a new accessible entry through the alley, accessible parking space to get into the building on that ground level. Programmatically, on the left, you see what's existing. On the right, you see what was proposed and ultimately built. We wanted to certainly upgrade the building and the program, but we also wanted to be as realistic and as lightly touching some of the interior walls, structural walls, as we could, to reuse as much as of what was able to be reused structurally. The basement level was largely gutted, the interior walls and underpinning. We did foundation waterproofing as well along this basement. This is partially below grade level. You see here, we retrofitted this existing unit into a lounge. This is a common lounge space, which serves both as study space and meeting space, a new laundry room, larger mechanical room, a bike room, IT room, and all of these units, there's 3 units on this level, were accessible type A units. This is an enlarged plan of that large floor plan. You see here, as I mentioned, this is the access to accessible entry into this study space, lounge, and all new accessible units. On the first floor, which is really serves as the main entrance off of 30th Street, we kept the demising wall layout and tried to do as little as we needed to as from a layout perspective, but opened up the kitchens, which were dark and outdated, opened up the bathrooms a bit, all new finishes and fixtures. This was a plaster and lath building, which were severely damaged, in which we had to try to salvage, but in the end, we ended up doing new furring walls and new drywall ceilings and new drywall interior partitions. In addition to that, we utilized existing closets as our vertical heat pump closets. So taking away the small closet space meant we had to find ways to incorporate storage for the fellows, which was accomplished with different built-ins in the bedrooms, which we can see later. Second floor, top floor, more of the same, kind of lightly touching the layouts, but really upgrading all the finishes and fixtures. And storage. This is program sections, which you can see how the building is laid out. And getting into the interior pictures. So this is the lounge on that ground floor, the accessible entry point on the rear there. This serves as the main kind of gathering space for the fellows, for quiet study, for interaction, for parties, and for study. This language of white oak, FSC certified white oak, is a common material we've used throughout our Dumbarton Oaks projects, including starting with the Fellowship House, which has become kind of a defining feature and characteristic of a lot of our Dumbarton Oaks projects. This is the main entry here, steps up to the first floor corridor, all new finishes and fixtures, and all new lighting as well. These are a couple of interior unit shots, all new kitchens. All these kitchens were previously enclosed and cramped. We opened that up to have more of an open concept, and you see some of the strategies here with our bedrooms to incorporate storage within the bedroom. All new bathroom finishes and fixtures, lighting treatments, or sorry, window treatments as well. And one of the things to talk about here from a sustainability standpoint, or from a health and wellness and efficiency standpoint, is that in working with GBS, one of the things that we ended up doing is circadian lighting in the units, a static system, which is lighting which corresponds with the with your circadian rhythm and the time of day. So this is, as a static system, this is achieved through the selected light bulbs, and in which is communicated through an education program that Dumbarton Oaks has with their tenants to teach them how their bodies react to light, natural light, and waning light over the course of the day, and which has been successful. This is the first project in which they've used that circadian lighting, and we're looking at doing it at another project as well. This is the rooftop view. You see our 36 panel layout here, which achieved about a 12.5 kW output. We went through OGB studies for this, and certainly it is a great savings for the building. One of the anecdotes we talk about when we talk about our Dumbarton Oaks projects is that this building existing before we got our hands on it was a far bigger energy sucker than the fellowship house was fully occupied with 25 units. So we had our goal, we had our issues with upgrading this building to make it as energy efficient as the fellowship house, which used geothermal energy, and we achieved that with a lot of these measures, VRF, the ERV DOAS, as well as the PV array. Like I had talked about briefly, Harvard GBS has is a arm of the Green Building Services up at Harvard, which is involved in all their capital projects. They have baseline measures, which are some of them are LEED Gold baseline measures, some go above them. We worked hand in hand with this team to implement some of these measures to achieve LEED CI version 3 gold, including integrated design, ventilation, energy reduction, life cycle costing, energy modeling, water use reduction, advanced commissioning. And in addition to that, one of the things that Harvard has implemented is this healthy materials initiatives. They are being Harvard, they have access to some of the foremost scientific research in the world on their own campus. And these teams work together in order to develop a database and develop strategies for healthy materials that go into their buildings, both their Cambridge campus buildings and as well as the off-campus buildings.
So David, I'm gonna jump in here.
Yeah, sure.
Carl, I'm just keeping an eye on the clock here.
Sure. Sorry.
It's time for us to move along. So thanks so much for presenting this terrific project of yours. This is an example of a project that both achieved a very high level of green building integration and sustainable design practice, and very high level of performance upgrade at the same time as going through the full rigorous historic preservation review, et cetera. So again, to Ralph and David, thanks so much for presenting. We're going to move on now to the next project. So again, thank you to David and Ralph. So the next project is the 13th Street Sanctuary project. It's an affordable co-housing adaptive reuse project of an existing, what was a church building that was deconsecrated. We have here with us today from StudioMB, who are the architects for it, David Bagnoli, AIA, to present the project. The project is located at 13th Street and Monroe Northwest. It's not a designated historic structure. And as you will see, it was completely overhauled, this high character traditional church building. It inserted a very innovative, affordable housing, co-housing lifestyle in it. It was awarded an AIA DC Washingtonian Magazine Design Award, which gives you an idea of kind of how well it was received in the design circles. And again, you'll see the work that was done to create a high performance building with a high performance building envelope, energy efficient systems, et cetera. So with that, I will ask David to join us and tell us about the 13th Street Sanctuary. David?
Great, thanks. I assume you can hear me, Carl, right?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, great. Let me go ahead and go full screen here. Thanks. Happy to have the opportunity to share a few lessons from our efforts on our 13th Street Sanctuary project, which is what we call our conversion of this 1917 church into affordable co-living housing units. As you can see, our project, as Carl mentioned, clearly falls outside what anyone might term historic preservation and soundly into the category of adaptive reuse, as the structure was neither individually listed nor considered contributing to a historic district. Now, before I get started, I thought I'd point out three things to keep in mind that come out throughout the presentation, which tie to the forum's topic today of stewardship in the environment. First is our collective responsibility to grapple with what Carl has interestingly termed cultural artifacts as a way to describe structures such as this church, which in this case was formerly a center of community life, but it lost its congregation, its original purpose. I'm sure everyone here recognizes these buildings still have a role to play as we grapple with how best to modify them to meet current demands of our changing city. Second is the technical challenges we just heard about from Ralph and David, and congratulations on such a wonderful project, guys. It was really nice to hear about that and see some of the great work you guys have been able to do. We also were faced with meeting DC's strict building and green energy codes. I'm not going to get into the details that to quite the degree you guys just did. I think you covered that very well, but we were faced with a very different problem of how to convert a structure that was originally designed as an assembly use with a singular large gathering space into affordable residential units. And then finally, I will touch on this new type of affordable housing that helps meet the demands raised in session 2, which Carl mentioned from the folks at OP, who noted during their presentation that there's a projection of 260,000 new DC residents over the next 20 years, 36,000 of which Mayor Bowser has ambitiously called for to be affordable. And as you'll see, this differs from other church to residential conversions that had happened here in town that you may be familiar with, as it's the first we know of that wasn't luxury condominiums and conversion, but rather a new type of affordable housing that at least partially answers this call the mayor put out for affordable housing options. The project, as Carl mentioned, is located in Columbia Heights. It's just north and east of the Target USA site. As you can see in the images on the bottom, it was the only non-multifamily structure at this location. The church had suffered significant structural damage during our Mid-Atlantic 2011 earthquake, which those of you who were here know was not a small event, after which that building was deemed unsafe and the congregation was forced to move out. Eventually, they rented it to another congregation, but ultimately had to sell the building after it couldn't find a viable buyer to maintain its liturgical use. As you can see, the structure generally appeared in pretty good condition when we arrived there in 2016, but once we started poking around, we saw it suffered from years of deferred maintenance, and we discovered a number of hidden structural damages, including at the building's only pinnacle, which you see down here at the bottom right, which was not entirely apparent at the time due to the growth of vines that obscured some pretty significant cracks. At this juncture, I think it's important to quickly point out that beyond the cultural and historic values of these old buildings is the idea of embodied versus operational carbon. For those who maybe don't follow these things, embodied carbon is shown on the upper left, and that relates to the impact the construction of a new building has on emissions, as opposed to operational carbon, which is really what David and Ralph were just referring to in their building, which is carbon is released after the building is delivered and functioning. Both LEED and the city's own green building standards place a pretty high focus on operational carbon, even while embodied carbon is projected, as you can see on the bottom right, to have an almost identical percentage of emissions over the next 30 years. And while we all know there's a tremendous amount we can do to ensure that the buildings operate efficiently, we're here today because we believe stewardship of the existing structures makes sense from an environmental perspective as well. When it comes to embodied carbon, it's already absorbed into the structure. So for us, it made that much more imperative that we work with the existing masonry and concrete structure, even as we work to convert it to residential use. So as you can see here on the bottom left, to make the project work, the owner needed to add an occupied level at the roof. And while the city zoning code required we maintain the character defining elements of that pinnacle, the center and crossing ridges, and the tower of the original tower, as well as the pediment ends of the church. So in addition to co-living, which you see on the top left, we also studied micro units and market rate condominiums. And as you can see, while micro units would have generated a total of 26 one-bedroom units, it also required by building code that we add a second stairwell to be included in the floor plan. From a budget and a pro forma perspective, the number of kitchens and beds for the micro unit option made for a much higher construction cost. And last but not least, is that our clients had come out of the affordable housing world and were much more interested in co-living as a type of affordable housing. And so we quickly moved to that approach. Now, co-living, if you're unfamiliar with it, is exactly what so many folks who come to DC may have done to land on their feet. That is renting a bedroom in a house with total strangers. So while living with roommates isn't new, co-living is a new model that's cost-effective, flexible, and allows tenants to rent sleeping rooms in larger and higher quality units with an amazing set of included services, as you can see here on the left, at a much lower price point than a studio or shared room. In our case, as you can see on the right, we have 8 units, 2 units per floor, with a new stair being inserted in that tower, along with that added level at the former roof. To accomplish the transition to residential use with such a density of rooms, we needed to insert windows for light and air, as well as egress to meet building code, and the details of which I'll get into in a minute. Our main entrance on the tower also meets fair housing requirements to get to our 2 lower accessible units. Now, to add that additional floor, we ended up pushing back from the west elevation along 13th Street, allowing that single pinnacle to remain a standalone element and actually became a focal point of a new roof terrace you'll see in a moment. On the right, I tried to diagram how complex adding this additional floor was. Basically, we needed to install shoring to hold up the existing roof, which ran from the foundation all the way up. And then we had to remove the supporting structure below and add floors and bearing walls until we were able to remove all that shoring. Now, in terms of the exterior, and as I mentioned, converting a large assembly space into residential units with multiple bedrooms was tricky, as it required us to introduce a large number of windows for light, air, and egress. We were initially interested and continued to be in creating a contrast between our insertions and the existing heavy masonry exteriors. In general, we feel strongly for an adaptive reuse project such as this, highlighting the old by differentiating it from the new in a restrained, almost Carlos Scarpa kind of way, actually accentuates the qualities of the older structure. But we knew this is really hard to pull off. So here you can see a few early studies of how we thought this might happen. At the bottom is our final approach, which even at this point didn't take into account the variation in the overall depth of the exterior wall plane, which we eventually resolved, as you can see here in this slide, which shows our deep window frames cut into and alongside the ornamental filigree of that existing structure, as well as the thick masonry walls of the tower and main body of the church, which changed from 18 inches thick at the base to just under 10 at the thinnest point of the assembly. This attitude also informed the upper floor addition with these added light scoop windows that you see here on the right. Now, in this section to the left, if you note the red dotted lines, that shows how these slots started to accommodate the overall variation and that great depth of the wall. It also shows the 2 new floors we inserted at the 2nd and 3rd level above the existing poured slab of the main sanctuary space in the cellar. Now, on the right, you can see that to insert these new floors, we had to remove the interior of the tower, which really wasn't accessible at the time, which was odd, but true, as well as a masonry and wood frame balcony in the assembly space. And then we inserted bearing walls and new floors, as I mentioned, to support the added level, and ultimately that existing roof. The whole team's goal was to restore the structure's damaged shell and incorporate significant interior and exterior ornamentation to create that tension between old and new that we were interested in achieving. On the left, you see the installation of the new 2nd floor, and on the top right, the walls being erected on that to support the new 3rd floor. And then finally, on the bottom right, you see the walls that rose up from the 3rd floor to hold the existing roof. You also can see that what to us looked like solid wood beams from down below actually turned out just to be stained 1x cladding around turnbuckle ties, all of which were not in the best of shape. From the exterior, we had to detail where we were cutting these slots, coordinate that on the elevation with the plan, and you can see the installation progress on the right from 13th Street. And here's just a detailed drawing of the slotted windows that you see here on the top right. And along with that image on the left, you can see the variation that I explained in the exterior wall plane that these slots had to accommodate. On the bottom right, our installation of rigid and bad insulation, with David got into a Quercia option case study in just a moment ago, where we had to put rigid and bad insulation on the interior face of the exterior walls to meet the district's green building code. And then a set or two include examples of how we incorporated original details, which I'll show and finish in a moment. So here's our completed west elevation with the accessible entry tower and stair on the left. And you can see the pinnacle with the setback of that added level on the right-hand side of the photo. The result of all this is a pretty striking balance of old and new that is further reinforced by the light and dark palette. It helps differentiate those new slotted windows and roof additions from the heavy masonry of the original structure. Now, when it came to the interior, we took a similar attitude as we did on the exterior, which is to grapple with the dense program of bedrooms and bathrooms, which allowed for the affordable co-living units to work, meant that the historic ornamentation would fall wherever it had to, and we would have to work it into whichever room it appeared. Additionally, we were interested in the quality of light coming into the units and having at least a recollection of the former liturgical use, and our large slotted windows allowed for that. For the stair, we similarly wanted to keep it apart from the wall of the tower and use a contrasting material of wood and metal. So quickly, here's our before and after plan, second and roof, and you'll note on the right, before our structural gymnastics to add the third floor, how it was just the roof. The first and cellar floor plans are quite similar to the second floor plan there. Now, I thought just to close this out, it might be interesting to quickly walk through the completed building interior. So from the outside, you see the stair and entry lit up on the left image, and the view from the opposite corner of the intersection with our new entry canopy and large slotted windows. As you move into the tower and look up, you see this new metal hung stair that's set off from the finished wall, which we ended up having to do in drywall because the underlying masonry of that tower was in such poor condition. As you walk up the stairs, you start to see a number of existing windows we were able to restore, which contrast and work well with the two new large slotted openings in the tower. As you get up to the top level and look back down, you really get a sense of that balance of old and new with the wood and metal stair and the large slotted openings, which can connect back visually to the sidewalks below. In regards to the units themselves, we tried hard to expose some of those interior details of the church where they fell, whether that was in the living room or bedrooms, as you can see here, or here in the roof shape of the upper two units, which shows the slope of the original roof and the flat ceiling of that new enclosure with the tall light scoop windows I mentioned, which provide the quality of light coming in the units that was reminiscent of the original liturgical use of the building. At one of the upper units, a number of these windows actually allow for views to this new roof terrace and that restored pinnacle, and here you can see that. And here you get to see a little bit of what we dealt with on the structural damages that we saw. The most visible one was these cracks that were on the before and after of this pinnacle, which we believe had shifted during the earthquake. You can see it on both the before and after. Just in closing, I think I hit my time. The technical challenges inherent in converting this type of structure into residential use really led to this introduction of these slot windows into the heavy masonry exterior, even while we were able to retain a sense of the building's original architecture and detail. We think we did a pretty good job of handling the structurally complex challenge of inserting new floors into the worship space while doing our part to meet affordability demands, along with the city's stringent standards for retaining significant architectural defining details while complying with the green building codes. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the office efforts of the folks in our office, Jean-Michel Humbert, Maureen McGee, and Sasha Peterson, who worked collaborative with me and our clients to retain the character of the original structure and to take advantage of its embodied carbon, something our office is extremely proud of, and we appreciate the opportunity to share the work with you today. Thanks, Carl.
Well, thank you so much, David, and really appreciate your presentation. There's when we tend to think about buildings that are kind of obsolete, that they're really no longer able to fulfill their original function, we tend to think of like industrial buildings. And here in Washington, D.C., we actually have a boatload of churches which are no longer being used as churches. And this is quite a striking example of taking a building that was obsolete for its original function and finding a new use for it. So thanks very much for your presentation of this interesting project. So the clock on the wall says it's time to move on. So we're going to move on to our next case study, which is a single family row house. The project is called the Net Zero Row House. As I said, it's a single family with an accessory dwelling unit added to it. We have here today with us from the architectural firm of Teass Warren, Will Teass AIA. So this project is located on Morris Place Northeast, kind of near the H Street corridor. It's not a designated historic structure. It is a complete overhaul of the two-story traditional DC row house. It was modernized and expanded to accommodate both the family, the owner family, but then also to create an accessory dwelling unit. And like the other projects that we've seen and the others that we will see today, the goal of creating a high-performance envelope, energy-efficient systems was then also, there was a goal here to really add the solar array and to make this a net zero energy design. So with that, Will, please present your net zero row house project.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear my audio okay. My name is Will Teass. I'm a principal with Teass Warren Architects, and this is a project that we've been working on for about 1.5 years. And I'm both the architect, but I'm also the client. This is actually a very personal project. The family that Carl was referring to is my own. My kids go to school across the street. My office is in the neighborhood. So this has got a very sort of personal touch that I'm happy to share with the group this morning. Really do appreciate the opportunity to share this project in such illustrious company. So the project here, really the thesis statement of this project was about converting a 1925 row house that was originally a 3-bedroom, 1-bath, small kitchen, small dining room, small living room into a net zero home for the 21st century family. And that family, you know, is 2 adults and 3 children. And part of the equation for us is we need space. You know, we need the bedrooms, we need the bathrooms, we need the kitchen. You know, when Carl and I were discussing this project early on, you know, we just live differently than we did in 1925, and that plan in this particular project and the layout reflects it. And, you know, I also want to talk about, you know, this is all of those sort of quote unquote evil things, right? This is a pop up, this is a pop back, but I would also contend that this is gentle density. You know, we are adding a lower level unit. This is missing middle housing. And part of the program here was at the ground floor, the second floor, and the third floor to have all of the characteristics of a single family home. But in the basement, we have an apartment that can be rented, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the detailed steps that we undertook to get to where we needed to be. So it's a little bit more data heavy than perhaps some of the previous presentations, but it really is a roadmap for, I think, how we could replicate this. You know, there are a number of row houses in the district. It's one of the predominant housing forms, and we feel like this is a replicatable formula that can be used to improve our housing stock. So the first step is really to bring on, you know, work with an energy model. We were very fortunate to find a group that was very tuned into our goals and had the expertise to help us. And they put together an energy model. And the goal here is to understand where's your energy going. So on the left-hand side here is a simple bar chart of just where the energy is going. Obviously, some is going to heating and cooling, but one of the things that was really striking for us was just how much energy goes into lights and appliances. On the right-hand side, this is part of the analysis that comes out of the model. And they did a very interesting thing in that they looked at all of these sort of upgrade options through the lens of cost, but also payback. And so these are sorted by payback. So, you know, each of these individual things has an impact on our what's called the home energy rating score, HERS score. So you can see that impact. You can also see sort of a projected, you know, annualized cost, and then what that payback would be, and really served as a roadmap for how we would get to that net zero goal. And, you know, things that you know, when we started the project, it was like, oh, we'll just, you know, we'll do a little bit more insulation, we'll do better windows. It turns out that actually has a very minimal impact on the HERS score and the energy usage. They're important, don't get me wrong, but there are other things, and really understanding where the energy going is a big part of this. Where we ended up was a bundling strategy. And so the goal is to take these different measures and group them together in a way that maximizes your energy performance, gets your HERS score down to that, you know, below zero level to truly get to that net zero designation. And so on the upper right hand side, you can see some of the data points, the characteristics that we're trying to hit in terms of the equipment that was specified and used. And then looking in the lower left hand corner, along the bottom rather, is really about those bundles. And we really sought to do the very bottom for the maximum amount, which in our case meant we were doing, you know, heat pump water heater, which we'll get to. We're doing Energy Star appliances, you know, high efficiency equipment, all those kinds of things. But the key issue here is really solar panels. That is the positive side of the equation, and so it's critical that you get as many solar panels as you possibly can on your roof. And so the roofing part of this is a bit of a challenge, right? Because row houses inherently they're usually already there. It's a site that we already have to contend with. So, you know, what can we do to maximize the number of panels that we have on the roof? And so in our case, the upper left-hand corner is a construction photo of just, there's probably 2 panels missing for a chimney and a vent and a skylight. But we really tried to put as many panels up there to achieve about we targeted 8.8, but we ended up with about a 7.9 kW array. And as part of the procurement process, we're able to project out those energy savings. So the graph you see in the middle is sort of when you're using electricity, the highest point, and then the summer for cooling, and then sort of the anticipated system production. Another aspect to this is what I would term decarbonization. So a key aspect to a net zero home is that you need to remove fossil fuels as a source for heating, hot water, cooking. And to that effect, the upper right-hand corner or the right-hand side is an image of the day the gas company came out and clipped the line. They actually dug up the sidewalk and severed our umbilical. So in terms of heating, the key issue there is electric, using a heat pump with inverter technology. And what that does is it modulates the motor speed, so you're not turning on or off. It can actually yield some pretty significant savings. The heat pump water heater is another key aspect in terms of how you produce domestic hot water for the home. And then also cooking. And sometimes this can be the most challenging. I think there's an inherent bias in the marketplace to have a gas appliance, and there's certainly a perception that this is a superior product. And I think part of our challenge is to demonstrate both in practice, but also as the architect and designer, to encourage folks as to induction ovens and electrical wall ovens as an option for alternatives. So the heat pump water heater, it's interesting that was number one on the list. I knew nothing about heat pump water heaters when I started this project, and I know a little bit more, but certainly I'm no expert. But really the simplest way to explain it, it's your refrigerator running in reverse. It takes energy out of the air, puts that and heats the water. On the upper right-hand side, you can see what that means physically in a space. I think from a row house perspective, it's a bit of a challenge because not only does this have a footprint, but it also requires a volume of air to circulate to properly function. In this case, we have a mechanical room that was just below the minimum size. There are venting kits that you can add to this to improve the circulation and the performance. The jury's still out. We may need to add that depending on how the performance goes, particularly in the cooler months. But this is one of the key features in terms of what that energy savings, where that comes from. Energy Star appliances are at this point are fairly ubiquitous. It's very easy to find them. In particular, if you go to aggregate sites, you can sort of sort by Energy Star by making sure that you're specifying and installing Energy Star dishwashers, washers, dryers, refrigerators. In this case, our heat pump and the heat pump water heater, both Energy Star ratings. So that's an important part of this. The other aspect that's key to this project is the HVAC system. And so we went with a very very efficient system that gave us a SEER rating of about 17.5 and an HPSF, our heat source power factor, of 11. And what that meant is an external heat pump on the outside. And on the left-hand side, you can see that as another construction photo of those two heat pumps set in place. One serves the lower level unit, the apartment. The other is connected to 3 of the air handlers that are scattered throughout the house. We zoned it in a way so that each floor has its own air handler, each floor has its own thermostat to try to improve the thermal comfort in such a vertical home. And I have to say, it's, having them up and running, it's quite comfortable. We're very happy with the investment that we made there. And I think, one thing we did want to talk a little bit about is and so I think everything up to this point has been to what you would need to do to get to a net zero row house. For us, it was really interesting to think about, how do we actually verify this? How do we is there a way to collect the data? And so we invested a lot of time and energy into thinking about how we might do that. So on the left-hand side here is an image. Everything is an app these days, right? So the left-hand side is the app that comes with the solar panel package. And so, as of today, we've produced 1.2 megawatts of electricity that we've pumped back in the grid. It's been really fun to watch the meter go backwards. That'll change as more systems come online, but it's very easy to document that amount of information. On the right-hand side is we have what's called a smart panel, and that allows us to track energy usage and energy consumption. And so you can see August, September, October as really just minor construction loads, but November, when the heat came on, you saw an incredible spike there. This particular system is a Leviton product, and each has addressable breakers, and each breaker kind of has a data point to it. So we can actually look at consumption on a per circuit basis. And I think the value there is when you do your energy modeling, you have to take a sort of code mandated values for your plug loads. And so what this will allow us to do is actually really monitor how much electricity we're truly using. And I think we're really, really curious to come back and benchmark this and share those results with everybody and understand how close we were able to achieve. We do have 2 units, so we do have 2 panels, and we've set this up in such a way that we can monitor both units, although the solar array is connected to the upper level unit. In conclusion, this was an incredible learning experience, to put it mildly. But I think what was most what we learned, I think, the most, that this is the future. I mean, this is just how we all have to shift to operate, whether it's at the small scale of a single home or a larger scale multifamily or commercial structure. We need to be conversant in these ideas and these technologies to some degree. And we also need to be able to rely on the experts to help us guide us. So to that end, I can't emphasize enough the value of the energy modeler and getting a good team member early on to help shape the direction of what project and trying to understand the direction that you want to take it, and really what those approaches, what they mean from a design perspective. Site design is something that has a negligible impact. At the end of the day, you're kind of fixed in your orientation. I would say we lucked out. We have a north-south orientation with a south-facing roof, and that worked out great to maximize solar yield. It would be a different story in a different circumstance. The other piece here is just making sure to maximize the roof plan so you can get as many solar panels. In this case, it affected sort of the placement of skylights and vents and those kinds of things. And we put a lot more energy and effort into the roof plan here to try to get 1 or 2 extra panels, because it does matter. It does add up, particularly over the course of time. And then I think finally, it's never too early to start doing this, and it's also never too late to change. We actually, in full disclosure, did not start out with a net zero Rowhouse goal. It was sort of a whimsical idea that my partner brought to me about putting solar panels on it, and then that kind of unfolded this incredible journey that we've been on over the past year, or year and a half, I should say, and we've learned a tremendous amount. I think we're probably pressed for questions, but if anybody is interested, we do maintain an Instagram account where we sort of share the progress of this. Some of it's related to net zero, some are net zero issues, some of it's just regular old construction and design updates. So with that, I think I'm concluded with my portion. Again, we really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks, Carl, for including us.
Well, thanks very much, Will. I appreciate your coming in today and spending this time with us. And, I can see that you spent your COVID time well. And now we're going to move on to the last of the housing case studies, the Park and Ford project, which is an office building converted to apartments. We have with us today Bonstra Haresign Architects, David Haresign, FAIA, going to present the project. So it's located in Alexandria, Virginia, not in DC per se, but we thought it was important to really show a office building, apartment building conversion project today. So we're thankful to have this. It's not a designated historic structure. It is an adaptive use of a late century, office tower. And as we know, we have an awful lot of those around to be dealing with in the future. You'll see that basically it's reconstructing everything but the superstructure. And again, another project with high performance envelope and energy efficiency, et cetera, as its goal. So with that, David, please present us with the Park and Ford project.
Hey, thanks, Carl. And also thanks to Rebecca for inviting us to participate in today's program. We're going to give a brief presentation today focused on a common and less notable but volumetric problem. We deal with a lot of large scale projects. Can you just, next slide? So, and all types of buildings that we convert to other uses, everything from schools, churches, existing row houses with buildings behind it, and office buildings. Next slide. So a lot of our work is for developers, mostly. They're not high-end institutional grade clients or even rich architects who can afford to do net zero buildings for themselves. So this is a problem that we see a lot in DC. There are office buildings that are underutilized. Clients have brought us these problems and asked us to take a look at what possibilities can happen. This project done by Hartman Cox up on Connecticut Avenue, we looked at converting to residential. Unfortunately for us, the client was able to, Bernstein Companies was able to capture an office user who took most of the project. Next slide. So our project is located on King Street, or just off King Street on Park Center Drive. You can see Interstate 395 to the south, King Street immediately to the sort of northeast, and it bleeds back into a residential neighborhood, mixed use. The project was, next slide. So the project was originally designed as a 3-building office building complex. I think that Philip Johnson came by here and was so inspired that he copied a number of features from this building for the shopping center building out in Tyson's Corner. You can see the undifferentiated curtain wall infill and also precast columns and a heavy precast top. Orientation wise, King Street on the right, Park Center Drive at the lower portion of the site plan. The park, what we'll call the park building, is the southern building, and the Ford building, the upper left hand building, there was a connector between those two buildings. They were built in the 1980s. Again, 3 buildings, Park Center Drive, Ford, and a building on King Street that is off in the upper picture on the right-hand side. The total gross area of this project was over 1 million square feet, including the parking garage. The existing uses, again, ground floor, some ground floor retail, 5 stories of subgrade parking, and total existing space is 1,500. Next slide. You can see some of the spaces underutilized, terrace space, underutilized places on the around the site that included some surface parking. And you can see again the kind of quality of the single glazed curtain wall system and the precast panels behind it. Next slide. So this project was really a lot about how do we adapt 2 office buildings to residential use. So it's a conversion project that required some that required us to go through a something called a DSUP, or a rezoning process for a change of use in Alexandria. Alexandria embraced this project as an exemplary project in terms of how to take old office buildings and adapt them to a different use. In addition, and probably one of the most important things is the carbon savings that one attains by retaining existing structure. Carl provided some articles, exemplary articles to us, which I didn't include in this slideshow, but Carl's probably more than happy to share them with you later. But they talk about the amount of embedded energy that's in large structures like this. So there's a concrete frame there, that's about 60% of the carbon embedment in these buildings. And we also saved the precast concrete columns that went around these buildings. Next slide. So we did, as we looked at these, there were a number of things that we looked at. There were things that, we wanted to retain, again, the cast in place concrete structure. By the way, the Ford building was a post-tension slab construction. It was one of the first in the Washington area. Core elements like stairs and elevators, existing column grids, and core depths all affected how one would plan a new residential building within an office building skin. We looked at replacing elements. The curtain wall was a single glazed, fixed tinted glass, fixed glass tinted window, very inefficient. Storefronts at the ground level, again, inefficient. Single stick aluminum systems. MEP systems were outdated. They were inefficient. They were central cooling systems, cooling and heating systems. Chilled water. They used chilled water and big shafts through the building for a constant volume system for commercial use. Site elements, we wanted to convert an existing parking level that was exposed at the front of the building to new residential terrace use, and underutilized exterior spaces at the back of the building were converted for active uses. So we converted the building, these two buildings, into 435 residential units and residential amenity spaces. In addition, we tucked in a childcare center in the lower levels of the parking garage. There were recaptures of items, like we were able to reduce the number of elevators from 5 to 4 in both buildings, and we recaptured also, we recaptured 2 in the Park building, 3 in the Ford building, and mechanical space as well. We followed NGBS, National Green Building Standards requirement by the City of Alexandria as a result of our special use permit submission. And we met the minimum requirements. We're working with developers who didn't have high aspiration for green building intentions, but we think that we made major improvements to the systems of this, to the building. We had to meet a very rigorous schedule for the DSUP. We started the project in October of 2017, filed for a DSUP in February of 2018, and achieved approvals for the DSUP right before the City of Alexandria started really up their water usage charges. We mentioned the column spacing as being a challenge. Locating plumbing risers in post-tension buildings is a big challenge. We had to use GPR scanning to locate cables for coring, that sort of thing. Exterior spaces, again, the lower area parking, garage level A, where there were some challenges for egress and ADA. Rear terraced areas on the backside of the Park building also provided some challenge, but we tried to conserve as many of the existing natural elements around the site, trees, shrubs, planters, those sorts of things, and incorporate it into the new design. Slide 8. Okay, so the intent of our facade, we were asked by our client to keep the precast elements. There was 58,000 square feet of existing precast column covers that were incorporated into the design. It was an undifferentiated grid. We introduced horizontals, strong horizontals with balconies at every third floor on most of the lower levels of the project to begin to differentiate and create a grid-like structure within these undifferentiated facades. There's also a single-story link building that was not very nice, kind of office space, and some nominal lobby space that we turned into kind of a central amenities building. We improved the, we used a unitized modular window system, which sped construction of the project. There was significant improvement in thermal performance. So the U factor is now 3 times lower than it was in the original building. We integrated kitchen and bathroom exhaust panels into the exterior wall, and there are colored panels integrated into the window system that create a serpentine pattern in the overall facade and create some interest. The glazing, we used a Guardian glass sun guard system, which is a double glazed low E insulated glazing unit. And again, we improved the U factor of the glazing system by a factor of 4, and we improved the solar heat gain coefficient by a factor of 2. There are balconies integrated into this project, which create outdoor spaces for a third of the units. So 30% of all the units have balconies. And the balconies are cantilevered from the interior facades. We call it a cassette system. So we provided structural steel members that the balconies actually were lifted and slid onto. And again, great time savings. Next slide. So the link building was an interesting problem for us. We originally suggested to the client that they soften the edges of this to make a stronger visual connection. They declined to do that, take on the cost of that. So we actually took the existing form, which had clipped corners, squared it off, simplified it, and created a entrance easily visible from one of the primary entrances of the site. Next slide. So these are some renderings of the lighting of the entrance piece. Next slide. Mechanical systems in this project, again, this is a developer-driven project. We used not super high, but higher SEER condenser units on the roof that feed each individual residential unit, and that provides individual controls to the units, so they're effectively used only when the units are occupied. We also use DOAS units to provide our common area and amenity HVAC systems. Electrical and plumbing systems were all new, basically, and we used LED lighting throughout the entire project. We started to do an energy analysis with Carl, and that kind of fell out after we couldn't quite bring it to closure. Next slide. So we're just going to go through these very quickly and show you before and after pictures. The before picture on the left, the after picture on the right. You can see the balconies that are inserted that create the rhythm on the exterior. Next slide. Entrance into the main entrance into the building, the new connector building, old on the left. Next slide. The rear, we took core elements from the rear of the building, we did strip the precast off of this and made some pretty interesting residential units. At the base of this, you can see the landscaping that's occurred on the terrace level. Next slide. Again, the landscaping in the rear on the terraces. Next slide. Interior lobby space. This project's not finished. It won't be finished until February. Next slide. And shots of the interior, the money unit in the back where we stripped the precast. Next slide. So, you know, these projects are large scale. They included an ownership team of low enterprises in DC and USAA as the primary investor. Our team included Lisa Medina, who worked with me from the beginning, along with John Edwards, an associate partner of our firm, and Ronnie Ali, who was the project architect. The city of Alexandria was tremendously cooperative in helping this project happen in a very quick time period. Next slide. And that's it.
Well, thank you so much, David. We really appreciate your making this presentation today. Yeah, this is a big topic, I think, for the future of our city, especially in the era of COVID, where, are you going to the office every day has, I think been disrupted perhaps for all time. This is super important building type. So we appreciate your coming and presenting it today. So we have raced through the morning here. I can't believe how quickly it's going. It's now time for a short break, and we'll reconvene at 10:30. So just in a little more than 10 minutes. We'll see you back again at 10:30. So welcome back, everyone. Wow, did the first 4 projects ever go by quickly here. Here we are at the midway point. So we're going to switch gears now and go from looking at residential projects to non-residential projects across a number of both commercial and institutional uses. And we're going to start with an institutional project, the old Naval Hospital, which is now known as the Hill Center, Community Center on Capitol Hill. So with us today is David Bell from Bell Architects, who's going to present this. As I said, it's located on Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast at 10th Street, Capitol Hill. It's a designated historic structure, and it's also a project that received historic tax credits and also a DC energy efficiency grant. So it literally a project that went through both a sustainability review and a historic preservation review. It's a meticulously restored building, a rehabilitation, turning it into a community center use. It's a recipient of multiple historic preservation awards, including, interestingly enough, the DC chapter of the AIA's Presidential Citation for Sustainable Design. So recognition by the local chapter in the sustainability of this preservation project. And again, you'll see in the presentation, the focus on really creating a high performance and energy efficient building. And with that, I'd like to invite David Bell to tell us about the old Naval Hospital. David?
So thanks, Carl. And thank you, DCPL, for letting me talk about this project. This is a project that we started working on in 2004. The last phase finished up in 2017, but the bulk of what I'll talk about was a project that ended in 2011, 2012. And that was to convert the building into the Hill Center from its sort of decrepit state. And I want to really talk about this from a preservation standpoint rather than an energy standpoint. That was our goal, was to start with that and mix those two things together to make sure that they were supportive goals in the process. Unlike some of the other projects we've seen, which were more focused on sort of energy performance, we took it from a different approach and tried to take advantage of the inherent aspects of the property and leverage those for not only a preservation outcome, but also for sound energy approach. The building is located, as Carl said, in Capitol Hill. And was built in 1865. In 1908, there were alterations and major renovations in 1911 to operate as a school for the hospital. And then it largely it fell into disuse. And of late, before the renovation, it was occupied partially by the local advisory neighborhood commission and some studios. The property retained a great deal of integrity, architectural integrity, but it had seen better days. You can see in this image that the front porch had been poorly recreated in the 1970s, and we took an approach of building it back. You also see window air conditioners and pretty decrepit windows. So that was our focus, was to really bring it back. We had multiple phases in the project. It was pretty bad on the inside, flooding damage, lots of deterioration, hazardous materials. So it was sort of hard to really see what could be, but that's what we were charged with. A lot of the exterior elements were accretions added to the building for various reasons, not all that successfully. And we started off by saying, okay, what are we going to do to the exterior to restore it to acceptable standards visually and performance-wise, and focus on restoration of the windows as the first step. So all of the windows that we have in the building are either original or modified original windows. We didn't replace any windows with modern materials, although on the upper and lower levels, we did introduce 5/8" insulating glass. On the primary floors, which you see in the photo on the upper right, that single glazed historic glass, original and restoration glass, with weather stripping upgrades and replicated hardware. So really a restoration approach. And that was still part of our approach for energy performance, knowing that we didn't have the ability to put in a high performing window, but we had the ability to modify the energy use in other ways. So all of the windows are operable. We rebuilt shutters for the lower level, really trying to take advantage of some of the strategies they had in the original building for responding to the climate, much more of a hands-on active participation of the residents rather than a modern mechanized solution. We did add insulation at the roof and the framed walls of the mansard, but that's largely the limitations of our insulation in the building, taking advantage of thermal mass walls. Doors, we restored the doors, including the main entrance door, where we grained the exterior and restored the original hardware. The approach that we took to analyze the building was to evaluate the historic resources, develop treatment zones, and guide the design based on where we could make interventions and where we had the opportunity to restore spaces. So that led to locations of existing stairs that we were restoring and new stairs that we were introducing, as well as an elevator that connected all 4 floors. It's part of our strategy for taking advantage of the thermal mass of the building. We use a ground source heat pump. This allowed us to pair the thermal mass of all of the interior bearing walls of the building as well as the ground, so that we use that thermal mass as a battery, essentially, to store energy, thermal energy, seasonally. It also helps in the shoulder seasons pretty well. We had to avoid problems introducing risks to the existing trees. We had to coordinate it with a new rain garden, and we had to avoid the archaeological resources which were identified on the eastern side of the site. So our 32 wells go down about 375 feet, and they're all located on the west side of the site. The existing building had a tunnel system below the main corridor of the lower level, and it had vertical gravity ventilation shafts throughout the building. And so we took advantage of that for all of our new systems. We didn't reintroduce a gravity system for ventilation, but we did use it to distribute piping and heat for the ground source heat pump. And when you look at the strategies for our project, they're related to systems like high performance lighting systems, energy efficient elevator, and to the point that in 2010, 2011, LED lighting was evolving very rapidly. So we waited till the last minute before we introduced the actual fixtures. And it's continued to evolve, and the lighting systems now are so much better than they were even back then. We have spray foam, open cell spray foam at the upper roof. We do have some concerns about that long run, and caution people about using that system because it could introduce entrap moisture and cause long-term problems. We've been monitoring that, and it's performing well in the building, but that's a caution. And then also I mentioned we restored the windows, and then for the rain garden, we actually paired that up with permeable pavers, so we actually retain almost 100% of stormwater on site. This is an example of the mechanical room piping system. So one thing I'll make note of is originally we had designed it for domestic hot water, but we were concerned that we wouldn't have the balance of heating and cooling demands throughout the season. So we introduced a gas-fired domestic hot water system. We also have gas cooking in the demonstration kitchen. I think in subsequent projects, we've used the geothermal for domestic hot water and induction cooktops, and that's a good way to really think about it being decarbonized. So we actually hit 67% energy efficiency based on target, and over 80% cost savings on our energy. By doing that, we didn't introduce any on-site solar. We weren't buying any off-site sustainable power, things like that. So dealing with the existing historic building, we were able to hit high performance standards, and we can do better now than we did back then. But we're trying to sort of demonstrate that historic buildings that were designed originally without air conditioning can become high efficiency buildings and still retain the character of those buildings and not lose the important aspects of both the interior and exterior. So just a few images of the project before and after. The main stair, we use a performance-based code compliance to allow the ornamental stair to be open throughout the whole site. Introduced new stairs that were fit into the various spaces in the building that had less historic character. It's important to have the connections through the building and the transoms and the lines of sight. Originally, we were even able to introduce an elevator to use the existing door openings because they happen to align. And we opened up some spaces to make them larger. Those were some of the most contentious issues, getting the preservation tax credits and Save America's Treasures approvals. Have a demonstration kitchen in the basement. And we restored the fence, and that was something that the community rallied around and thought it was very important. So the before shot of the west side, and then the after shot showing the pervious pavement and the rain garden. I think that this quote is important for us as we're talking about decarbonizing our infrastructure, is we really need to stretch and really need to look at the goals and go beyond what we think we can actually achieve. So
well, thank you, David. What a beautiful project and a terrific demonstration that preserving and restoring projects is a critical part of being sustainable. Just a wonderful model. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we're going to move on to our next non-residential project. This is a headquarters office building for the American Geophysical Union. We have here today Yolanda Cole, FAIA, from Hickok Cole Architects, who were the architects for the renovation project. This project is located at Florida Avenue and 20th Street Northwest within the DuPont Circle Historic District. And it's a comprehensive modernization of a late 20th century association headquarters, as I mentioned. It's the recipient of the first Department of Energy and Environment Clean Energy DC Award, to give you an idea of how far it really was able to go with performance. It's the second project that we've seen after Will Teass's zero net Rowhouse that really did strive to achieve zero net energy performance. And with that, Yolanda, take it away.
Well, thank you for having me this morning. I'm Yolanda Cole of Hickok Cole, and we're here to talk about one of our favorite projects, Project of the Heart, I like to say, which is the American Geophysical Union's headquarters. I have the mission up here because the mission is what made this project happen from many points of view. And you'll see they are an organization of earth and space scientists. Their mission is to get that word out to the public and to educate all of us for the benefit of humanity and the environment. So what's better to do that than to do a net zero energy building? All right, so on the right, this is a construction photo. So I want to keep in mind, if you go this top that we're going to be talking about a little bit later, which does not exist on the existing building. It is at Florida and 20th Street. It is built in 1994. It was built for AGU by Shalom Varanis. It is a beloved and quirky building in the neighborhood, and we felt it was important to maintain the quirk and maintain the love while also transforming it into a net zero energy building. It's only 62,000 square feet, so having a small building in an urban core and taking it to net zero energy is no easy task. 5 floors above grade, a concourse, and another parking level below grade. It is in the DuPont Circle Historic District. I'm right on the edge of it. So that had its own challenges, which we'll talk about here in a minute. It's owner occupied, so it is a nonprofit organization. So they do have ways of financing these sorts of projects that make that doable, I guess you'd say, for them. Being part of their mission, it's not just about them and their people and their staff, but also they had conference facilities that they rent out to the public. They wanted a member lounge so that they could invite their scientific members who are in town and happen to be and work in the space. And also there is an exhibition area that talks about what AGU does as part of their education of the public. The goals are also very important because it goes right to their mission. This tree, as we refer to it, our tree on the right is the image that we took into the initial interview for this project. And our tact on this was, yes, we have to do something to the building, and it's easy for architects and engineers to get all wrapped up in the technology and design of the building, but really we're doing this for the benefit of people, and that's the humanity and environment pieces of their mission. So we had to think about how the people were going to be living in this new kind of space and what behaviors and differences they would have to make in order to live in and work in a net zero energy building. So as I mentioned, they wanted to showcase their members' work. These are their goals. Promote collaboration. This is within their own groups. Like many associations, they were in mostly in private offices. The CEO gave us the directive that she was going to sit in an open office area, and so was everybody else. So that was really, an interesting goal to start with an open office space. They want to lead by example. This is really important. They want to be a catalyst, and they wanted to make this a project as a demonstration for others so that they would follow. Develop a 21st century workspace, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then raise the visibility of AGU for members of science. So all of the scientific data and information that's going to be gathered on this building will be available online, open source, with the scrutiny of all of their scientists. So you can imagine how this was in the beginning as we were designing this project. Here's the site located at Florida and 20th, rather triangular spaceship shape, unusual, although its iconography was really about a ship. So this is referred to here in this middle photograph as the prow. It also had lots of iconography of planets. There are planets in the sidewalks and in the friezes. So all of these things were about what they do, and we love those. So certainly we wanted to maintain and build upon those. You'll see there's no hat, no solar array at the top, and that was one of the challenges we had to make as designers, to put this array on top of an existing building. It's not historic itself, but again, in a historic district. So in order to get this project approved, we had lots and lots of people that we had to talk to. None, not the least of which you're all familiar with, I'm sure, are the community groups. So the ANC, their zoning preservation and development group, the DuPont Circle Conservancy, and the citizens associations. So we hosted all of these meetings in AGU's headquarters, the current building, invited them in. AGU, to their credit, created a blog with all the information always available to anyone at any time. We presented many times to all of these groups. In addition, we had this DC government on board, and I would say, because back to the mission, the DC government was very interested in seeing a net energy building in the city. This is the first. And some of the technologies that we looked into and were able to incorporate were really groundbreaking, and they were partners with this in this endeavor, which is really a great thing. I was telling Carl yesterday that the story we love to tell about the historic piece of this is that HPRB, while supportive of the mission of net zero, was concerned about what it would mean to put a solar array on a building in a historic district, never mind on historic buildings in the future. So this was going to be some kind of precedent-setting project, and I think there was a little bit of concern about this. But what happened is that the ANCs and even the historic groups, community groups, were so bought into the mission of net zero and maintaining this building that they were the ones that pressed HPRB to approve the project. So what a turnaround for those of you out there who have been on the other side many times. So we're very proud of that. And in the end, certainly all the government agencies supported us as well. I'm just going to flip through some of the sustainable strategies. We studied many of them during this process with Interface Engineering, who was there with us from day one all along. But I'm only going to show you some of the more interesting ones. There were 21, I believe, in total that we used. First is the electrochromic glazing, think transition lenses, if you will. So they automatically dim and brighten the window envelope to respond to the sun and what's happening on the outside. You can also manually override this if you want to have a brighter room. So this was pretty, interesting, and we were able to get the subcontractor here to give us a good deal on it because they really wanted to see this in action. So hopefully now they can do that for others the same. The entire envelope had to be redone and include all of the insulation. Everything on the inside essentially was taken off and redone to make a tight envelope. Probably the most interesting and crazy thing that we did on this project was the municipal heat exchange. It's the first time this was done in North America, also being done almost at the same time, although we beat them, DC Water for their headquarters, with a different system, but similar concept. So there was a very large sewer line out in Florida Avenue that we were able to open up, which you can see here in the photo, and tap into as a heat exchange. And this goes directly from the well into the lower levels of the building of the parking, and you can actually go as part of the tour and see, glass encased, you can see the whole system. So this was pretty groundbreaking and actually works extremely well. There's very little conditioning that even needs to be done in the building at this point in time. That is associated with a radiant ceiling. Radiant ceiling is done more in Europe, and we do have examples of that here in the DC region, but it's not widespread at this point in time. Radiant is a great feeling. It's a great way to deliver cooling because things aren't blowing on you, you're blowing air. So it's quiet, and it's also beautiful the way they've incorporated it into the ceiling panels. Also, a little bit unusual is rather than taking the DC power and turning it into from the solar array and turning it into AC to then get to the desktops, we have direct current DC directly from the solar array to the desktops. We also have a backup system that's AC here and there throughout the building because this was a bit unusual as well. But it does make a little bit of difference when you're looking for all of the energy savings you can get in such a small building. So of all the primary ways of getting to positive energy, so it's not just net zero, but you have to build in a little buffer of say 3 to 5%, so you can make sure you can get to it. You can see there are some. These are the different strategies we had and how they contribute to that through this system of reducing, reclaiming, absorbing, and generating energy on site. Get to the end here. Oops, sorry. In addition, it was very important for AGU to reuse materials. So this is kind of pre-carbon discussions. I mean, people are starting to think about carbon at this point in time, but a lot of it was a focus on energy conservation and energy generation. But they were also focused on the fact that reusing their existing building, which they intended to be in for a very long time, also reusing materials. So in a crazy thought, we ground up all the toilets in the existing building and incorporated them into the terrazzo. So we have it in the terrazzo, in the floor, in the lobby. It was also used in the terrazzo for the boardroom table. So that's always a fun story to tell. In addition, the original building had this compass built into the floor, which they wanted to maintain. The original desk also had this petrified wood, which we reused as well. And then the brick that we took away in the process of opening up some of the facade was then taken away, cleaned, and brought back to the site to help build the new penthouse. So there is a nice reuse story in this project as well. And just as a final here, some photographs of the building, the concept being the cross-section through the member sciences. And so each floor has its own set of sciences that represents that is introduced here in the lobby. This is the exhibitry about what AGU does. This is the member lounge over here on the right bottom. This is where anybody can come and work and join them. This is the space between the exhibit and the member lounge. And then this is a typical office workspace, which is now fully open. My favorite place though in the building is under the sky. So on the space floor at the very top, we had introduced an internal stair to get people moving and connecting them throughout the building. That takes us up to the sky and beyond, if you will. So that's it. Did I do that in my 15 minutes or 10 minutes?
That was terrific. Yes, okay. Very much so.
Feels really fast, you know?
Right. Yeah. We're just we're trying to do too much in too little time, but I really appreciate doing that. and you know, this is such a great project, and you know, it's kind of humbling to realize that, you know, here you have this very mission-driven client who really wanted to sort of push the envelope, and realizing that, well, you know, 5 years from now, this is the standard. This is how every building is supposed to, you know, be going. So, you know, it's really important for us to be paying attention to examples like this. So thanks again for being with us today, Yolanda. What a terrific project.
Thank you. And we can only hope. So let's all go out and do it.
Indeed. So now we're going to move on to another just terrific non-residential project. This is the Powell Elementary School, which, as it sounds, is a DC public school located at Upshur Street at 13th Northwest. We have with us today Rick Schneider, FAIA from iStudio, the architects for the renovation and addition to Powell Elementary School. It is a designated historic DC public school. Actually, that type, that the DC public schools as a group are a designated historic building category. And you'll see that it's both a comprehensive renovation of the existing historic building and then a very substantial addition, which is kind of what all the DC public school projects have been over the last nearly 20 years now. It's a recipient of many design awards, and very interestingly enough, was included in this year, the 2021 Venice Architectural Biennale in Venice, Italy. And one more time, we'll see the focus on high performance, envelope, and energy efficient systems. And there's a particularly interesting focus on multiple passive design strategies as well, in a lot of ways relating to some of the things that David Bell was showing us with the Old Naval Hospital. So with that, turn it over to Rick.
I'll just start by saying thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to present here, Carl. It's great to be here today to talk about this case study. I'll hit some highlights for this one rather than kind of digging in too deeply, but it's worth saying at the start that we're here today because the DC Preservation League and Historic Buildings, which is the mission, preserving them, have a critical role to play in climate action. I think we know that, and that's sort of why these case studies are being presented. And so in preserving and conserving our historic buildings, we give architects, planners, and designers like myself and like many of you here, the opportunity to learn from history. We can learn about things like scale, materiality, symbolism, but also, oh, hang on, did I not advance there? Let's see, am I not advancing? There we go. Okay, so we're seeing the next slide there. So give us historic buildings, and preserving them gives us an opportunity to learn from history. We can learn about scale, materiality, symbolism, but also things like building location, orientation, and the building systems themselves too. We have a lot to learn from history. And so I think Powell Elementary School is a good example of that, because like many DC public school projects, we were both rehabilitating a historic building and also building in ways that were sympathetic to that and adding to it, because many of the schools are growing in this neighborhood in particular. So Powell Elementary School, you can see here this wonderful two-story brick neo-colonial building. There are a couple features I'll point out right at the start, but let me tell you where it's located first of all, at the corner of Upshur and 14th Street Northwest, right there. So it's sort of a straight shot line from the National Mall. You can see here the north elevation of the building along Upshur Street. And this is a great place to sort of show you what our scope was. The existing historic building represented by this pedimented portico was that building. And then the 2 stories worth of glazing to the left immediately, which is the 1929 building, it in fact was not completed symmetrically at the time. And then to the left of that was a 1959 addition. And so what we did was we took that sort of existing left-hand 1929 wing, we emulated that with a building that sort of completed in some ways the symmetry of that 1929, again, sort of neo-colonial building. And then we also built a new wing because they needed more classrooms to the right in the image here, which is to the west. And that started to mirror what was happening in the 1959 building while still building on the some of the units that you see in the glazing there. And so we were immediately drawing from the historicity of that existing 1929 building and the 1959 building as well. Site plan explains it. Essentially, the 1929 building is an L-shaped existing building, and then the 1959 building immediately to the east. North is up in this plan. So we built an L-shaped addition that gave us additional classrooms on the west. And then we also built this other wing, building D, which holds library, music room, and other support spaces like that. The master plan centered around 2 green spaces. And we designed the building itself so that you could connect with visually and physically with those spaces. And that helped to define some of the architecture. But before I get there, I have an interesting story to tell everyone. You can see from this image, there's a lot in the historic building to draw from. We'll note that there were operable windows, not always a given these days in modern buildings and schools. And additionally, there's a nice little detail here, which is this lattice brick, which provided a little bit of security for some rooms that were behind them. We saw that on both of those. A small amount of it, but worth noting. But even more than that is this lantern. That's not just there for show, but you do notice that there are both windows and louvers in that sucker. So I'll talk a little bit more about that and how that functions. As we were doing our due diligence and surveying, we noticed something really interesting in every single classroom in the 1925 building on both stories. What we noticed was that there was a grill located low in the wall, and that behind the grill in each classroom was a duct that led immediately to the attic space above. Why was that there, we asked ourselves? Well, they had blocked what was essentially a rudimentary form of solar chimney. That was a place to exhaust hot air that was building up in the attic. So every single classroom, when it got hot, in those shoulder seasons when it has a tendency to do, students or teachers would open the windows, and then cool, fresh air would flow into the classrooms, and the hot, stale air would flow up into the attic. And that lantern had a very particular function. It was there to expel the hot, stale air, because as we know, hot air rises. Nature abhors a vacuum. Two things that actually function very well in this. And so we said, well, that's a really interesting historic functionality in the building. And so while we were considering material, fenestration, scale, proportion, we were also looking at the historic building systems here. And that led to us emulating those systems and maybe even building on them too. So we were learning from history as we went along here. You can see in this image right here, there's your lantern, right? Not just there for symbolism. And then the existing pedimented portico, and to the left, the existing 1929 building. We came up with a somewhat symmetrical addition, but changed the fenestration around because HPO is not looking for us, and the secretary's rules are not for us to ape or mimic, but rather to emulate. And so that's what we did there. But then we continued classrooms to the right that started to emulate and mimic some of the proportions of the 1959 building, but with additional sort of, if you will, new proportions, and then opportunity to sort of provide a little bit of shading in those late spring and early fall months. Okay, so you're seeing us start to emulate in terms of scale, fenestration, and then also the building systems as well. HPO actually let us off the hook as we turn the corner and go to the south elevation here. What you're seeing is an opportunity that we took advantage of to provide daylighting, but control that daylighting, and also some natural ventilation too. You can see it in these horizontal louvers along the south facade, and then vertical louvers along the west facade. You also see these little bay windows, which were opportunities, programmatic opportunities for them to take advantage of natural ventilation, or sorry, more of the daylighting and the views to the outside. And you can see peeking up above here, these very functional solar chimneys. What's a solar chimney? Well, a solar chimney functions a lot like that historic 1929 building, allowing us to bring in cool, fresh air and then expel the hot, stale air, and take that sort of natural process of heat rising and nature abhorring a vacuum and sort of speed that up a little bit with the solar chimney. Solar chimney takes advantage of a superheated chamber with non-UV glass that builds up heat and then allows us to expel the hot air very quickly. We want to be aware of which direction the air is flowing, which direction the sun is shining, and sort of calibrate this thing so that we can take advantage of powerful cycles of air and sunshine. We do the same with the daylighting, but we don't just rely on rules of thumb too. We engaged our engineers in doing computational fluid dynamics to make sure that we had the calculations right. We took advantage of, or we started to sort of dig into some of the rules of thumb we know, which are a 2-to-1 outflow to inflow. We want a 2-to-1 outflow to inflow ratio in order to help facilitate the airflow. And you actually start to feel the air moving along as you go through the space. So daylighting and natural ventilation are two things that really define the architecture here. Here you can see the, one example of the solar chimney, and this is the bay window, taking advantage of both the horizontal louvers and perforated metal screens to help provide some screening and cut down on heat gain within the building. These provide really nice breakout spaces for students. And so at the same time as we're thinking about how we want to fenestrate and then shade our buildings, we're also thinking about the impact on the program on the interior. This is a great wide spot in the hall where a teacher could come out with a couple of students, because schools are always looking for ways to teach that are outside of just the typical desks lined up in the classroom. There are great lessons that the student can take home with them too. We tell students what we're doing in the school as well. We explain to them what a natural chimney is doing. And so you can see, in the evening, you get a nice sort of expression of these functionalities, right? Which is some architects love. And then, oops, I didn't get there. Let's go back here real quick. Let me go back to that spot there. We actually provided signage in the hallway adjacent to the natural chimneys that talk to students about what a natural solar chimney is. That it functions a lot like a chimney they might have in their home, but instead of expelling smoke, it actually expels hot air to make their classrooms more comfortable, cooler, fresh air. And these are lessons that the students can take home with them. We also tell them that these are things that come from, historicity. These were great things that we were able to pitch not just to the client. The client was really excited that we could build the first natural solar chimneys on a DC public school, and that they also drew from historic precedents. So when we made our pitches to historic preservation, we talked with them about, again, those things like materiality. We talked about scale and symbolism, but we also talked about emulating historic building systems. And they were really excited at the fact that we were learning from historic buildings and not just copying what we could see, but also understanding how they functioned. And so what's nice here is that as you look at the south facade of the Powell Elementary School, the sort of non-historic side, 50 years will be historic, right? What you can see is a way to read the building. And so when we were reading the 1929 building, we said, well, that lantern is there for a reason. We found out why as we uncovered the ductwork and the louvers inside the classrooms. And here too, someone could take a look at an elevation and say, well, that's clearly a south elevation because I've got these horizontal louvers that help to, provide shading from a steep sun angle. Meanwhile, on the western elevation, you see these vertical louvers because, as we know, the sun is harder to shade on a western and eastern elevation, and the horizontal louvers don't do much for you because the sun starts to drop low and can sneak in between them. Well, the western elevation has the vertical louvers so that it can start to shade that way. And as we provide these shading opportunities, we provide two things there, really. Daylighting gives us an opportunity to light the facility without using electric light, human-made light sources. And it's worth noting that every time you flick a light switch in Washington, D.C. in a public school, or in any building really, you're most likely to be burning coal in Western Pennsylvania to get that electricity. We're working on that when we buy green energy, which is great, but wouldn't it be nice to sort of provide on-site sources for lighting? Same thing with the ventilation too, right? When we're providing natural ventilation, we're all of a sudden providing opportunities for us to capture energy and do that on-site rather than using off-site energy to power our cooling and ventilation systems. And that's really great. That helps us with operational energy, which is one way to start to lessen the environmental footprint of the buildings. And of course, as we know, the rehabilitation of the historic buildings themselves, by reusing them, we're actually getting at embodied energy, embodied carbon. And so this building, in many ways, is an example of rehabilitating the historic building in order to, take advantage of embodied carbon, embodied energy. And then when we build new, to do that in a way that uses energy sources that are on site there, so that we can also lessen the operational energy of the building itself.
Well,
it's nice when say that
Rick,
again.
It's terrific to see a project that has such a sort of a striking contemporary look to it and really understand the stories of really how it's tied to your inspiration in really understanding how this historic buildings, which were built without a great addiction to fossil fuels, and how they functioned as well. So thank you so much for spending time with us today and
pleasure.
showing us this terrific project. And believe it or not, we are going to go on to the last of our 8 case studies.
No worries. It's a pleasure, Carl. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again, Rick.
Bye.
And so this is going to be a presentation on the Southeast Neighborhood Library, another institutional, DC institutional project. Actually, 3 of our 4, non-residential projects are these, DC institutions. And this is a restoration of a historic Carnegie library. And we have here from Quinn Evans Architects, Julia Seipel, AIA, who's going to present this project. It's located at 7th Street Northeast at D, just off of Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast, or excuse me, Northeast, and no, Southeast, sorry. It is obviously a designated historic building. It's a Carnegie Library. It's a restoration and modernization of the historic building, plus an addition to the historic library. And what we're going to hear about today is a Department of Energy and Environment Innovation grant that Quinn Evans received to study the embodied carbon dimensions of a rehabilitation project like this. So with that, Julia, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me to share this project today. And as you mentioned, this is a really great project that Quinn Evans is working on. It's an ongoing project. We are actually in the midst of design right now. That design is looking at many different aspects of the value of existing buildings and the value of that preserving existing buildings for this for neighborhood, really special community feature. But what I really want to focus on today is this innovation grant. And this is a special opportunity that, I think it's great that the DC Department of Energy and Environment creates these grants. There were other opportunities. We also got a grant related to net zero energy design as well. So for this grant, I think it's really looking at what we were doing to understand and quantify and really measure the value of reuse and reusing this existing building. And beyond that, what are we doing proactively? What are we doing in the renovation of this building to understand the embodied carbon and that impact and the opportunity? What can we do to improve that? So I think, Quinn Evans and Carl in particular has this very long legacy of touting the greenest building is the one that is already there. So what can we do to better measure that and bring that into this conversation of carbon, and that being really about the future of improving our buildings and really valuing what is already there. So as you mentioned, this is a historic landmark. It's a really special building that was one of the 3 original Carnegie libraries in DC. This is a photo on the left, part of the historic landmark application. This building was originally constructed in 1922, and then what it looks like today. And this is right across the street from the Eastern Market Metro. This is a very prominent location. You can see, though, that there's some issues in terms of access. There's lots of things in terms of modernizing and updating this library that the project aims to address. I want to just give you a bit of the context here of the project and the wider effort of really how important this will be for this ongoing evolution of this resource for the community and a great historic building, but also then really get into, well, how do we approach this when it came to better understanding the embodied carbon and measuring and quantifying that, both for what's existing and what we were doing as part of our project. So the project involves, it's an existing kind of 2-story building with a basement, really a challenging situation of how do you preserve this this mass of and character of the historic building. Can't go up, can't go out. It was a very tight site. So in order to kind of meet those demands and needs of additional space, that really led us to thinking about, well, how do we go down? That was really the last place to go. But in that, the challenges of getting great space and great natural light. So a big feature of the renovation is looking at natural daylight studies and ways that we're getting light through kind of the existing skylight above and expanding that, and then also opening up and giving some daylight to those spaces that are below grade. This project is doing a lot of things beyond the embodied carbon in terms of how do we help promote additional sustainability features, pursuing LEED Gold, actually looking at electrifying this building as well. But I wanted to talk about a little bit, how do we get into our strategies for lower embodied carbon? Basically the project will be continued to be designed and developed through 2022 and expected to be constructed in 23 and 24. This is a project that we were working on with Whiting Turner for DC Public Library, and Silman is the structural engineer in the project, and we're very much involved with our embodied carbon analysis because as you'll see, we were very focused on what can we be doing with the structure of this building, especially with all this additional below grade added space, to think about ways to not just value what we are doing by preserving this building, but what can we be doing to improve the embodied carbon of what we're adding to. So this is just a rendering of what it looks like in terms of, you can see here what is the existing building, and then this kind of new entry, a new accessible entry, and then opening up for some additional skylight and natural daylight space into the building. And just across the street is the Eastern Market Metro. So the project goals for the purposes of the grant were really to research our strategies for reducing embodied carbon, really focusing on, like I said, on reuse and what are those high impact materials that we would be using, particularly concrete and steel. The structure of a building is typically more than 50% of what is accounted for in the embodied carbon of construction. So what can we do to better understand and reduce that in our design process? We looked at coming up with a clear methodology. How do we better look in early phases of design on benchmarking and understanding those biggest opportunities for reduction? And then we were doing actually some measurements and conducting embodied carbon analysis, understanding kind of those relative impacts of the strategies, how much difference would they make, coming up with the numbers to support that. And then lastly, what does this mean for this project and for future projects? You know, in many ways, it's great that we're in the middle of design, so we can take some of these recommendations and incorporate that as the design goes forward, but also thinking about how we can use those on other projects, particularly in this region. And we've talked about embodied carbon, a number of different case studies, and really the value of reuse and thinking about building less, because as we know, a big amount of embodied carbon is really what is involved with getting this building in place, getting all these materials to site, constructing, and then even thinking about the end of life phase too. What does it mean when we are doing demo as well? So not just the energy and what it takes to be running these buildings, but really thinking a little bit more holistically in a way that really values existing buildings and what we can be doing to reduce the impact and the footprint our buildings have. So basically the strategies that we're pushing forward here through this investigation and this project were reuse and ways that we could be renovating and reusing whatever possible, designing with less, So simplified materials palette, and thinking about what are those materials that could be lower carbon, and then kind of further optimizing. So once we have that materials palette, what can we be doing to lower the types of carbon and materials in that specification, particularly concrete, I'll say, to make that even a greater improvement for the project. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard this before, how big of a concrete has of an impact. It really is, when we think back to that pie chart, one of the biggest impacts on kind of global carbon emissions. Concrete alone is at least 6 to 10% of those global carbon emissions. So we're looking really at the various ways that we could be reducing our use of concrete, but it's a very valuable material. I think it's something that we are not going to be eliminating anytime soon. So what are the ways that we can be improving it? And particularly in the cement and this stage of what's actually involved with making concrete, that really is responsible for a bulk of the embodied carbon emissions. And there's a lot of ways in terms of cement replacement, or even things like carbon injection that we can be doing to improve the total GWP impact of concrete. So this was kind of our takeaway in terms of the reduced carbon strategies for our concrete, was using less of it, understanding what was locally available, looking at ways that we could have longer cure times, utilizing different things like carbon cure and ways that we can inject carbon into the concrete. There's various ways you can use better aggregates and and alternatives to our cement, and then other kind of non-fossil fuel based cementitious concrete materials. So things like recycled glass. I think what's challenging is that balance of, well, how much does this cost? And where is the threshold of what you can get into your project at very minimal cost? And where does this start to be kind of an initiative? And then who pays for it on the, is that the client? How can the city support these initiatives too? So I think emphasizing this kind of step here, this conversation. I think that was a big thing about this grant initiative for us, is it led to really strong conversations, especially with our design team and working with Whiting Turner and our concrete suppliers, kind of understanding where the market is here today and what can be provided. We'll see very typically things like slag or other cementitious materials are used in the ways that concrete is made in a way that doesn't actually add much cost change to the project. So I think for us, it was understanding some of these were beyond kind of no cost changes, and how do we continue to kind of push for understanding where the market is and where we are asking and trying to look for these opportunities for improvements. So what we were doing once it came to actually measuring, how do we sit relative to these different comparisons? What are we doing to establish the embodied carbon of the existing building and its value versus our strategies for design, and then designing to improve our concrete mixes? So basically, we're looking at strategies to baseline the existing. What are we doing in the new building? How much of that material is going in? And then looking at a few different ways that we could modify those structural designs. Maybe we could cut back the amount of concrete we're using, or kind of play with some of those variables of the amount of materials to achieve the same outcome, and see what we could do with those design solutions to kind of design our way to better carbon outcomes. And then lastly, kind of that optimization of the spec. Like, what can we do with the mix? 0% cementitious replacement is kind of worst case versus up to a 50% replacement being kind of what we modeled as kind of our aggressive case. So just to kind of quickly explain our structural design choices here, we were looking at fairly.
Julia, just let me ask you to run through these next couple in just a minute or so.
Sure. Yeah. Basically, the outcomes, these are the tools that we were using. The outcomes were that you have to really think about the stages of design and whether you're benchmarking or getting into specific materials to prioritize, and then how you look at optimizing that through your specifications. So these are kind of the tools that we use in our toolbox to better get to kind of estimating all the way down to very specific targets for our GWP. And so then the takeaway, I guess, for us is that, yes, there's a good bit of savings by just reusing the existing building. There's even greater saving opportunities if you can get to a pretty ambitious target for the cementitious replacement of the material. So with that, I'll turn it back to you. And thanks, Carl. I think this is a really great conversation about how to value our existing buildings and how to really quantify those improvements as we push to make changes both to the existing building stock when it comes to carbon and climate.
Well, thank you very much, Julia. What a terrific presentation, and I'm so happy to see that the district has invested in really trying to understand embodied carbon in not just this type of project, but in all projects entirely. So that is our 8 case study presentation. I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes and just add a couple of closing thoughts here. I want to start by just thanking everybody for spending the time today and really giving us these incredible examples of just the spectrum of work that's being done, not just with reusing existing buildings, but really trying to understand how reusing existing buildings is, really has to play a critical role in our climate action plan, and particularly, here in Washington, D.C. I just want to start by saying, the here in Washington, D.C. is a hugely important dimension of our program today. These issues and the climate action plan that we're really being thrust to pay attention to over the next couple of decades, it's happening in the context of a living, breathing city, and every one of these projects has something to say about the life in the city and the importance of the existing building stock in really maintaining an affordable city, an accessible city, sustaining the cultural life of the city, et cetera. Just to sort of underscore that, the first and the last of the non-residential projects with the old Naval Hospital and the Southeast Library, these are 2 cultural institutions, part of the community life, public institutions, and they're both just absolutely gorgeous preservation projects where there's nothing about the preservation of a historic property that is being compromised to be part of the climate action agenda. In fact, it's really exploiting what it means to reuse buildings, because there's a very important lesson there. So I want to thank Ralph Cunningham and Dave Coxson with the presentation of La Quercia from Dumbarton Oaks. It really is an example that it is possible to stick to the knitting of historic preservation and yet, really achieve sustainable development goals at a very high level. And, look, that was a project that went through the whole historic review process, and still, there's a substantial amount of renewable energy. I love the story about the sort of the interest that the Harvard standards had on the sort of co-benefits of energy efficiency and healthy materials and so on. I think it's important to keep all of those in mind. The 13th Street Sanctuary project, I know that for historic preservation people with a capital H and a capital P, radical building reuses like the 13th Street Sanctuary is problematic. I mean, we look at those and say, is that really the right, does that what it means to be compatible and with historic building reuse? And I think it's important for us to understand that around the world where there are societies with many, many, many more historic buildings, this approach that we saw that StudioMB took is actually much more commonplace. And the 13th Street Sanctuary is a recognition of that there are buildings that have become obsolete, and as I said earlier, Quinn Evans has been involved with things like power plants that are then being converted to reuse, whether it's housing or office reuse or whatever. And here in DC, we have a long list of churches that are either truly abandoned, as this one was, or hardly being used. So this is a building type that is entering our obsolete building type challenge. And what we saw with the solution that David Bagnoli presented is really looking to also an innovative, affordable housing solution. So I think it's an important type of project. With all of these, we're beginning to see two factors which I think are on the rise in the climate action plan that we need to keep in mind as being part of our future. The first is the incorporation of renewable energy resources. As I can tell you that as we look at grid scale renewable energy solutions and the need to clean up our grid, the importance of distributed renewable energy and actually individual, buildings and individual homes having their own renewable energy sources is really going to ramp up a lot over the next decade or so. And then, of course, the other topic, which we heard a lot about, from time to time, but then, certainly Julia's study for the Southeast Library, really brings it home. This notion of embodied emissions, and I have to say from a preservation standpoint, avoided emissions is huge. So we certainly saw that in the net zero Rowhouse project that Will Teass presented. This notion of energy modeling really being something that needs to become a standard part of what we do when we design property, including building reuse projects. And I think for that project, it's also important for us to take into account the importance of affordable housing and affordability, even for families to live in DC. And Will didn't get to talk about this much, but I know that the addition of an accessory dwelling unit into that property essentially made it possible economically for that project to even go forward. And I think we have to keep those things in mind. It's important. And they'll just underscore again the importance that net zero, that is going to become the code standard before long. And we need to really begin to aspire to it. The Park and Ford project that David Haresign presented to us, I don't think I can underscore enough the importance of changing use. And this is something that from the historic building stock is absolutely a lesson that flexible use buildings that can change back and forth between residential and non-residential uses. My historic office on Connecticut Avenue for many years was built as a single family house, was a multi-family apartment building for years, now, while I was there, residential and commercial office and retail combined. And the building really didn't change much to accommodate all of those different uses. It's an extremely important part of what we're doing here. And the other thing I would just note about David's project is that, Park and Ford really also shows a strategy of taking a building that was devoted to cars and site devoted to parking in these empty plazas, in quotes, and really activating not just the buildings, but the site around them as well. David talked a couple times about, it was a developer-driven process, and I think it's important for us to recognize the importance of codes and what code standards are. And again, I'll just note that the 2021 codes are 80% below baseline. So we're getting to near net zero just with code compliance. And again, by 2030, at the very latest, net zero being the actual code standard. So here it comes. Switching again to the non-residential buildings, as I said a minute ago, the old Navy hospital, the Naval Hospital, and the Southeast Library, I think, are interesting bookends on being able to do absolutely uncompromised historic preservation work and understanding what it takes to bring buildings back, to really exploit the inherent sustainability qualities of traditional design. And yet, at the same time, even within the restrictions of that, to understand that there's still plenty of room for innovation. I mean, the ground source heat pump system that was at the old Naval Hospital, just everything that Julia talked about with Southeast Library, and understanding just things like low embodied carbon concrete are enormously important for the future. The American Geophysical Union that Yolanda Cole showed us really is pointed to very widely in our community about just how important really on these kind of mid to larger scale commercial buildings and institutional buildings, that it's important to aim for net zero, and it's actually possible to get there. The innovations like the municipal heat exchange, which I think is a hilariously cleaned up name for getting your heat from the sewers, just shows you that there's sort of like no limits to the importance of being innovative and the opportunities that are there. I also found the AGU project a very interesting case study on renewable energy and bringing solar resources in. I don't know whether Yolanda said this, but the solar panels actually project beyond the property line, and that was in and of itself something that really needed to be carefully worked through to allow it to happen in a historic district. And I think that their design does a wonderful job of incorporating that. She mentioned a couple things about really moving to talking about carbon as a criteria. And again, that's coming to us. Rick Snyder's discussion of the Powell Elementary School really rang home for me, the whole notion of learning from history. And I don't think we spend nearly enough time on this. And as I said at my opening remarks at the outset, this is not just about aligning historic preservation and building reuse with climate action and community development priorities. It's also helping our city recognize that those priorities and that climate action plan does not sufficiently take into consideration the value of existing resources and the lessons from the historic building stock. So it's important for us to really tell those stories. You look at the south facade of Powell, and with the louvers and things like that, and oh my God, that's just so contemporary. And just remember that many buildings in the District of Columbia in the 19th century had things like awnings and shutters and things like that to do those same jobs. There's many lessons to be learned from heritage buildings, and just the idea of being performance focused in our design decisions that really came from Rick's understanding of that historic building and then how he translated it into a new building. And then the Southeast Library study, it's enormously exciting to me to see the district asking this question: how do we begin to look at embodied emissions? And it's a very important aspect of this. Frankly, the difference between the Paris Climate Summit 2015 and the Glasgow Climate Summit in 2021, probably the biggest difference in the conversation was about recognizing that embodied emissions, in other words, industrial related emissions to whatever activity, whether it's transportation activities or building activities, that they also need to be zeroed out. And it's highly problematic, and it's something that we all really need to pay attention to. And look at the hierarchy that Julia's study underscores. Number one, the most important thing is to reuse an existing resource, that the avoided carbon in that is unequaled by any new building solution. The number two is design to use less. And that's as true for us as preservationists as it is for new building designers. And then last but not least is to dig into the weeds and understand things like low embodied carbon concrete and bio-based materials and things like that. We have to get to the bottom of it. All of these different elements of carbon pollution need to reach zero, all of them. And I think we got a great overview today about how important the existing building stock and the reuse and adaptation of the existing building stock is to be able to achieve those net zero goals. So thank you very much. And I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to conclude our program for us today.
Thank you so much, Carl. One thing before you go, Carl, could you maybe mention a little bit about what's coming up in the spring with the program series?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So this, believe it or not, is only the halfway point in our program series. And excuse me, we began to dig into the specifics today with really understanding this spectrum of building reuse. But we're going to, next two programs, we're really going to get into the weeds on two very important topics that you heard a lot about today. The first one is renewable energy. And then the second one is embodied and avoided carbon. I think many people have a feeling for what the challenges are with renewable energy. And we're going to look at all three scales of on-site, what's called district renewables, in other words, kind of neighborhood level renewables, and then also what's happening at the grid scale with the renewables. And then for the embodied and avoided carbon, really understanding the inherent embodied carbon issues that are, or opportunities, I should say, that are inherent with building reuse and with historic preservation. But then also understanding how to have embodied carbon be part of our design process. And we got to see that from Julia. And then last but not least, I think something that is probably a very important policy dimension to this, and that is to help the District of Columbia recognize that the avoided carbon of building reuse is something that is actually calculatable, it's quantifiable, and we need to see policy and program that supports avoided carbon as an economic lever to really help us reuse the existing building stock. The last program is going to be sort of to tie up all the loose ends and to bring us back to building reuse and historic building reuse particularly and its importance in reaching our community development priorities and implementing our climate action plan. So that's the look for 2022.
Thank you, Carl. Really appreciate you giving a summary of those. I'd like to again just thank our sponsors of this event and our speakers. They were incredible. I think that I know not everybody just imagines that a preservation organization would be welcoming of other types of adaptive reuse, but I think we all need to be in this together in order to make a better climate for the future. And so highlighting projects that aren't necessarily preservation projects, but they are reuse of existing buildings is really important. I know that one of our panelists was surprised when I had told them that we actually had looked at their building for designation, but had passed on it. And I think that that's usually a surprise to a lot of people, that as a preservation organization, there are buildings that our landmarks committee looks at and determines that it does not meet the criteria, and they do not proceed with looking at designating it. So I think that there's a place for all of us in this discussion, and we look forward to continuing our seat at the table. And you all have joined us today, so thank you, and look forward to seeing you all in the spring for the continuation of this series. So thank you all very much, and have a great afternoon.